We just had a fabulous first episode of Sasvy Real Raw Talk. And
Oh,
I
my
want
goodness.
to, let's kind of dialogue and see what came of what your thoughts were, Kristen.
Yes. So this was, I think that number one, this episode exceeds my expectations that I had for, not that I had a whole lot of expectations around ours, but this episode exceeds all expectations. We had such a rich and just profoundly interesting conversation with our three guests. This is going to be something that I will encourage people to definitely set aside some time and allow yourself to sink into it. I would call it very accessible and a bit of a stretch in a way, just to kind of think about things a little bit differently.
Yes, I agree. I feel that they took us through a storyline of fear, what brings us the polarization in our mind, in our mindsets, and they took us around to being empathic to other people's views, and then the latter part of awe, understanding what awe means and how we can cultivate it more in our lives.
Yes, and I love that we actually there were some great recommendations of different authors to look into, and we will be sharing those as well in the show notes. And I love that we had three distinct backgrounds of theory and three different backgrounds of study, and how interrelated they were, and how just the overlap between them, and at the end of the day, I think the big takeaway here, or for myself, I would say that the biggest takeaway is the empathy piece, coupled with the just striving to remain as human and as present as we can in these incredibly, incredibly challenging times.
Well said, Kristen. All right, well, tune in, watch the episode. I hope you enjoy it. And if you have any comments, please put it in the comment section.
Absolutely. Right. Yes. Stay well, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Hi, welcome to Sasvy Real Raw Talk. I'm Margie Torres, along with my co-producer, Kristen Brown. And today we're going to discuss the polarized mind and ways to manage it. We have three guests with us today. Dr. Schneider is a licensed psychologist and leading spokesperson for contemporary existential humanistic psychology. And Dr. Schneider is co-founder and current president of the Existential Humanistic Institute, council member and candidate for president of the American Psychological Association. Dr. Schneider has written 13 books, including Awakening to Awe and The Polarized Mind, Why It's Killing Us and What We Can Do About It. Dr. Tom Pyszczynski is a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. Along with his colleagues at the University of Arizona, he developed terror management theory, which explores the existential terror and role of death in life. Dr. Pyszczynski has published over 250 articles in peer-reviewed journals and has co-authored several books, including In the Wake of 9/11, The Psychology of Terror, and The Worm at the Core, The Role of Death in Life. And Dr. Lewis Hoffman is a licensed psychotherapist and executive director of the Rocky Mountain Humanistic Counseling and Psychological Association. He is a fellow member in 5 divisions of the American Psychological Association for his contributions in professional psychology. Dr. Hoffman has edited 16 books and published 100 articles in journals and book chapters. He is co-founder of the International Institute for Existential Humanistic Psychology in Southeast Asia. So Kirk, Tom, and Lewis, welcome to Sasvy. Thanks for joining us today. So to help us set the format here at as Sasvy producers, we created this forum to encourage organic and fluid conversations to happen. So what will happen is we'll allow the conversations to flow. However, if there are any terms or things that might be questionable for our viewers, we might stop you and ask for you to clarify that particular point.
We're hoping that this reaches some folks who are not familiar with the term and the concepts that we're going to be presenting. So definitely we are looking to engage with audiences at kind of wherever they are around this topic.
Perfect. So when we invited you, we were really intrigued by the book title, The Polarized Mind, Why It's Killing Us and What We Can Do About It. So we'd like to kick off our discussion by helping our viewers understand what the polarized mind means by asking each of you how you personally came to this topic and what compelled you to write or be engaged in its discussion. So anyone can start.
I guess I'll start since I wrote the book, at least on that part. So I define the polarized mind as the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view. And I see this as one of the I would say, psycho-spiritual plagues throughout human history, going back to the first recorded writings of human history, Babylonian myths, for example, which focused on themes of overreaching and immortality, striving for immortality and going beyond what a vulnerable human is capable of and the price that one could pay for that. So I see this problem of the fixation on a single point of view to the utter exclusion of competing points of view as repeating over and over again through history, especially in power centers through history. You know, from Babylonian times up through Egyptian and Greek and Roman and, Western Christendom.
Kirk, would you be willing to talk a little bit more about kind of the power centers in terms of kind of what those, not necessarily just the geographical description of it, but those different components within a society or civilization that would be considered power centers?
Yeah, I'm talking about the centers of military and financial power mainly, and power in terms of conquest. So ancient Greece is certainly an example, and they developed the concept of hubris, which is very closely related to the polarized mind. And hubris is the overreaching of an individual or a society toward some kind of conquest. It usually has to do with a striving toward immortality in some sense, toward great power or showing one's power. And the Greek myth, Greek historians have unpacked what a cost this has exacted in their own civilizations. For example, in their fights with the Persians, and how Greek overreaching at points caused these great backlashes on the part of the Persians that are called nemesis. So you have hubris, and then the backlash against hubris is nemesis, which is sometimes more of a conquest mentality and a reactivity than the original hubris that started the cycle. And then you just get into this vicious, polarizing cycle that in my studies is driven basically by fear and anxiety. And that fear and anxiety often comes from some forms of intense individual and collective trauma. Well, anyway, we could explore that much further. I think we're going to get into that when we talk more about terror management theory, for example. And
Well, I was going to say that sounds like that's a great place maybe for Tom, for you to pick up and share your background a little bit.
Sure. For the last 30 years or so, I've been involved in developing and testing terror management theory with a couple of friends from grad school, Jeff Greenberg at University of Arizona and Sheldon Solomon at Skidmore College. The basic idea there is that human awareness of death plays an important role in much of what we do, especially when we're not actively thinking about it. You know, unlike other animals, we're intelligent enough to know that we have to die someday, and that creates a potential for overwhelming anxiety, or we would say terror. And our ancestors adapted to that problem by using the meaning systems they were developing, the way they were understanding the world. They used those beliefs to manage or control that fear. So the basic idea is that awareness of death creates this potential for terror that influenced the ideas that early humans came up with to understand the world, and influences the ideas that we today cling to give us a sense of meaning and significance and permanence. And that sense of meaning is one part of the system that we use to control our anxiety. A sense of personal value or self-esteem is the other part. So the idea then is that in order to keep our anxiety at bay, we need to maintain faith in our worldview that comes from our culture. We call it a cultural view, and get self-esteem by living up to the standards that are part of that worldview. So polarization results from different worldviews. And, take in our country today, we have many different worldviews, but one way of cutting up that pie is to think of them as liberal and conservative. That's become a very important identity. And the idea is that polarization results from clinging to our own worldview to protect us from anxiety. And that's problematic, because in order for our worldviews to give us that sense of security, we need to believe they're absolutely correct. Of course, there's no way of knowing that. So what we do is we rely on other people's sharing those beliefs and values to make it feel like they're correct. So for example, if you're feeling cold in an ordinary situation, you might ask if other people are feeling cold, and if they're not, if you're feeling cold and other people aren't, that suggests it's not objectively cold. So for example, if I have a political belief, like that Black Lives Matter, for example, I'm able to maintain confidence in that, and that gives me a sense of security when other people share it. When other people disagree with that, it undermines that consensus. It undermines that sense that that's the way everybody sees it, that's the way it really is, which releases the anxiety, which we then respond to by putting those people down to diffuse the threat. So if I want to believe that Donald Trump is the best president that ever existed, and other people don't see that, I may not realize it, but that's a problem for me, in that it undermines the consensus. It undermines the tendency, the belief that everyone sees it, that gives me confidence and faith in my worldview. So we think of polarization as a result of this need for security that we get from our worldviews being challenged by other people who see things differently, driving us apart. And we've also done, 25, 30 years of research looking at how when people are reminded of threatening things, they become more polarized, more hostile towards people who see things differently. Did a lot of research after 9/11, looking at how 9/11, which was a dramatic reminder of death, drove political extremism. And of course, right now we've got COVID, which is another dramatic reminder of death that, again, I think is playing a big role. COVID didn't start the process of polarization. That's been going on forever. But the fact that COVID is constantly on our minds and literally in the air is a constant reminder how vulnerable we are and that we could die at any time. That fear, whether we admit it or not, is driving polarization.
So, Lewis, I want to make sure and have hear kind of your journey to coming to polarization. But I'm afraid that I might forget my question for Tom if I don't jump in. And so I guess one of the things that comes to mind as you're describing this is what I guess I have seen, I feel like over the years with, the onset of both, I guess maybe it started with cable television and then it has just kind of exploded with all of the streaming opportunities where we're able to so easily get information that does support these views that we have, right? That it's very easy for people to seek out information that just essentially confirms their beliefs. So do you, and I put this maybe to everyone, is that kind of part of what we're seeing too in terms of the polarization and maybe the increase of polarization, or does that is that something that you feel like is relevant?
Absolutely. There's decades of traditions in social psychology, experimental social psychology, where I come from, of different lines of research showing that people need other people need to get confirmation in their beliefs, and in order to feel like they're being objective. So I might want to believe something, but if there's no confirmation, I don't have confidence. So we seek confirmation, but unfortunately, because those beliefs are giving us protection and security, a sense of meaning and value, and that's so important to us, and we're so basically at the root very frightened, we're seek that validation in a biased way. So people seek out information that confirms what they want to believe, and they avoid what they don't. An example of that, last night after it was announced that Donald Trump has COVID, I sort of went back and forth between MSNBC and Fox. And on MSNBC, there was a constant display of pictures of Trump in crowds without a mask and talking about his risk factors, being that he was old and obese. On Fox, they were all saying, well, he only has one risk factor, he's old. And they were showing lots and lots of pictures. I never saw him before of him wearing a mask. So these news outlets are feeding the narratives that help people maintain their side of the polarized worldview.
Yeah, just to add to that quickly, I think we seek sameness and certainty with the polarized mind. We're doing everything we can to avoid any hint of what we're trying to oppose. And what we're trying to oppose is some great sense of fragility, insignificance, smallness, and ultimately a sense of, I think, not counting, death anxiety. I think that this is the complex symbol of death that Ernest Becker talks about, not necessarily some physical notion of death, although certainly that's integral to it, but complex symbol of death is terror of oblivion, of not mattering anymore. So people do everything they can to fill that vacuum, in my view. But Louis, I'm curious about your perspective on this as well.
Yeah, well, thanks. I guess I came with some similar roots of strong influences from both Rollo May and terror management theory, but also some from background in religion and multicultural as well. And one of the things that has really fascinated me with polarization, even before that word has been used a little bit more, is looking at some of the religious models around this. And there's a great quote from Ernest Becker that I'm not going to get this exactly right, but he starts off saying, "What then is the ideal for mental health? A lived, compelling illusion," is his answer, which I think is very similar to May's idea of myth. And then he goes on to say, one that does not lie basically about the human condition and does not need to kill in order to support that position, which I think is an interesting way of putting it. We've seen this quite often, where what could be myth or belief in need of security has turned into certainty. We've seen that certainly in religion in a number of ways, that when religion becomes too certain of itself is often when religion becomes dangerous. And so that, I think, was one of the early paths I took to looking at this topic, although certainly a lot of Kirk's work has really helped provide some clarity and insight to it. But another thread that I think is important to look at with this is the thread of empathy. And one of the places I've really looked at it over time is cultural empathy, as we see a lot of the polarization around issues around culture and race. This idea of being able to understand these different perspectives. And there's always some significant limitations in that. But we can never fully understand what it's like to be someone from a different race or cultural background. But the barriers that we put in place there, and the refusal to understand that often, really can be problematic, sometimes because it threatens our own security, which I think ties to some of the things Tom has shared as well. But I think empathy is one of those really important avenues to try and address polarization, that if we can get some deeper empathy. Tom had mentioned Black Lives Matter, which has been another place of strong interest of mine, and wrote an article with some colleagues on that a number of years back. But it's fascinating to look at the misinformation about Black Lives Matter that is so prevalent. And we can see it through these different news channels very much, that if you watch about Black Lives Matter on Fox News and MSNBC, it's going to be very similar to the type of differences that Tom was referring to with Trump's diagnosis of COVID. But Black Lives Matter has had such a problem with misinformation that on their website, they note that and request that when this misinformation is out there, to contact them to help try and combat that. But I think that cultural empathy piece of not being able to put ourselves in a position to understand what it might be like for someone from a different cultural background really plays a significant role in some of the polarization that we are seeing.
So that reminds me of something that I heard just recently about robocalls being sent out. About 85,000 robocalls being sent out of misinformation to potential people of color and their and the suppression of the vote, basically. So, do you see this polarization, this suppression of vote, relating to the polarization and increasing and in contributing to that?
I would say certainly that. I think there's that it plays a role in there, and that the information about the voting, we've seen it go through that very polarized process as well. That despite there being very minimal evidence about voter fraud, there's a lot of people that really are buying heavily into this. And what I found is interesting is I try to spend a lot of my time when I'm watching the news instead of going to the news channels, I actually go to some of the fact check sources. And that's one of the first places I like to go to read the news a lot of times. That's where I start off my day most of the time. And it's, you know, it's fascinating because you can, when you start with that lens and then you come and look at a lot of this information from voter fraud to a lot of the others, and you start hearing these arguments, you see it through a little bit of a different lens sometimes because you've seen the evidence on both sides of the arguments. The good fact-checking sources that are more partisan really do a nice job of trying to show both sides of the article, both sides of the argument in most situations. Although there are times where there's just not much legitimate information on one side of the argument, even though it's being touted. So yeah, I think certainly it does play a role in there. And I think one area of polarization that comes, and Nathaniel Granger does a beautiful job of talking about this, and even has a lovely poem on this called I think What You Fear, I think, or What I Fear is the name of it.
Yeah.
But how that fear of people from different racial backgrounds often can have such a prominent influence on the way that we interpret a lot of information.
Yeah. I think this plays into stereotypes too.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
People can manipulate stereotypes very readily if they're hitting on people's fears. And stereotypes, I believe, see, we hardly ever get to these issues in the regular news or general discussion of politics in the media, but they get to underlying anxieties and traumas that people have, and trauma tends to like weld associations together, and they give people a kind of a vision of something very generalized. So like all liberals, you know, are elitist, you know, they don't care about you. So they might be preying on, let's say, some people of color and saying that the liberals really don't care about you. They're in ivory towers, they're in their suburbs. Look at how horrible their welfare programs have been for so many, nothing has changed, et cetera. Or on the other side, you know, how horrible conservatives are, that they're you know, just gun-toting, women-hating bigots, and that's it. And of course, these things inflame many people's underlying anxieties about kernels of truth in both sides. And we might get to this later, but this is something that we try to address and work with and work through to some degree in these dialogue groups that I've been a part of, Braver Angels being one of those.
At the same time, those stereotypes give, they diffuse any challenge to our own beliefs that the other side poses. So if all conservatives are racists, they're not to be trusted. If all conservatives are hostile towards the poor, well, they're not the kind of people we want to take seriously, right? Mm-hmm. All liberals are elite academics. Of course, they're not, just us, we are. You know, again, who would pay attention to those guys? But the idea is that the stereotype helps people dismiss the other point of view, yeah, because the stereotype is usually coupled with negativity. You know, not all stereotypes, you know, there's neutral stereotypes of groups, but the ones that people zoom in on are the bad sort. And it's usually some very core moral issues with the other group that we can't tolerate, and therefore we shouldn't take them seriously, which hopefully is one of the things that Better Angels would help us get beyond.
We're trying. It's a desperate struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously these things are very difficult for people. We just had an article, it was an article in The Guardian yesterday about a gay woman and a man who represents Focus on the Family. I don't know if he's from the Colorado area. I know, Louis, that organization is centered in one of the towns there, but they participated in Braver Angels dialogues and somehow were able to become friendly, and you might even say friends with one another, even though they were on such opposing sides at the beginning. And they're still on very opposing sides on many, many issues. But somehow they gain the fortitude to sit with one another and to appreciate more of the humanity of each other. I believe that this is a direction worth pursuing. It's certainly not a panacea, and it may not be changing minds in a strict policy sense, but maybe it's changing hearts to the extent that we can be more civil with one another. And then that would be a huge leap, evolutionary leap, it seems to me.
It brings to mind too Scalia and Ginsburg's relationship that after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, that has been in the news a lot. And looking to some of these models of places of success is, I think, really important, which is, I think, some of the things you've really been doing in your work more recently, Kirk. And I think those are desperately needed as signs of hope in some ways. But I think we're seeing polarization. When we put it in that political landscape, it's changing some. It used to be between Republicans and Democrats, for example, but now we're even seeing a lot of polarization within kind of the sides, so to speak. I don't like using that language, sides, because that in some ways is buying into this polarization scheme. But we're seeing within Democrats and more progressive minded people sometimes this language of if you're not exactly with me, you're part of the problem, which and as these groups get smaller and smaller, really the only option for one of these polarized groups to get their way politically is to have some type of totalitarian regime that's oppressing the majority of people that disagree with them. And I think we lose sight of that in some of the basic principles of a country like the United States, of a democracy like the United States, is that none of us get exactly what we want. And all of us may have some things that we're not willing to compromise on. I'm not going to compromise on racism in political policy. That's one that to me is just unacceptable, period. But for most things, we've got to find ways to be able to compromise. But if you do that as a politician, that can be very detrimental to your career anymore. So one of the concerns that I really have is, and it's not to say that politicians are innocent victims in this. I think they very much play a role in the problem quite often, but they are increasingly pushed in a direction where if they don't function from a polarized place, particularly as it gets close to election time, it's hard for them to get reelected because they're getting hit from both sides.
Right. They're in ambiguity, and ambiguity is very tough for most of us to deal with, especially if we are scared. We're so often scared in today's world.
We've talked so much about fear as being the underlying current around polarization and just our whole angst that we have as humans. And so I guess one question that comes to mind as I was listening to our last bit of conversation was, so, it's how have we managed to stay so fearful despite, I think it was Steven Pinker, whose book examines that we're actually, so many things are so much better in our lives right now, and we have access to information, and we have so how in this enlightened time is fear able to proliferate as it does?
One of the problems, and I think that this is something, the three of us come from different perspectives, and I think it might be useful to your listeners or viewers, I guess.
Listeners.
You know, to get a sense of that in a second. But part of the problem is that one of the basic facts of life is we're going to die, and death is inevitable, and it could come at any time for a lot of reasons that are not very pleasant to deal with. We don't know what, if anything, happens afterwards. We don't know what it might feel like, but we know it's a certainty. And we are animals that evolved to stay alive. You know, natural selection selected for a whole host of biological and psychological systems that keep us alive long enough so that we can reproduce, and then our genes are passed on. Death, you know, from the perspective of chair management theory, which I work on, and the existential and some of the humanistic traditions that Kirk and Lewis worked from, that preceded chair management theory by a long time, death is the worm at the core. And that's not a new idea either. That's something that goes back to the, you know, the earliest philosophers and before, the very first written document that we were aware of. The very first narrative is the Epoch of Gilgamesh, a king grappling with the death of his best friend and the implication that he's going to die someday soon. That's the first written thing we have from our ancestors. And it's just something that's not going to go away. And, you know, like today, we have COVID. 19 years ago, we had 9/11 and a string of terrorist attacks that stretched before and after. There's wars, there's diseases, there was AIDS, there's cancer. You know, it's just something that it's a fact of life. And although medicine is getting better, you know, what I think everybody realizes, even if we stay healthy, eventually it's going to catch up with us. Mm-hmm. And that's hard, you know, it's not impossible to accept. And I think that's an important, you know, focus for psychotherapy and maybe educational programs, but it's very hard to get around, and it's disturbing.
Yeah, and I would say, as to the question of why now so much, it seems to me that part of the reason is that we're more and more wedded to our computers and to the digitalized world, the high-tech world, the efficiency model for living. So I think maybe as a populace, we're getting less and less exposure to and ability to deal with more of the natural challenges of being human. And also, I think our world, since the onset of the Industrial Revolution, and this is something I think Michel Foucault writes very eloquently about, since the onset of the Industrial Revolution, we have really, in some ways, set ourselves on a kind of hyper-sanitization of life, and a technocratic and technicization of life. Again, I think the polarization problems at play here, that we're doing everything we can to avoid any hint of the terror, the death terror, the groundlessness terror of, for example, the Dark Ages that we emerged out of. And the bubonic plague seemed to have quite a bit to do with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Wonderful things came out of it too. You know, the Enlightenment, rational thinking was emphasized more. Standard of living was raised. So we're all beneficiaries of it. But did we throw the baby out with the bathwater, you know, such that maybe we are, we're a little precious in terms of, you know, dealing with the natural challenges of living, and as a result, we've narrowed our scope. And I'm afraid that this COVID thing is going to make us narrow our scope even more, become even more wedded to high tech, to, you know, computer technology, We see all the video, obviously, platforms, we're on them now. You know, how much will kids, for example, be exposed to raw contact with nature? You know, athletics and just exploration of the unknown and the wild. I think that's tougher and tougher to do when you have less and less contact with it.
So Kirk, in your book, you had the meaning of awe. Can you expand on that for our viewers? We thought that that was a very eloquent way of kind of bridging how we get out of this polarization, or pointing towards a way out or a way beyond.
Yeah, thank you. I see awe as one potential form of redress, if you will, to the polarized mind, because the sense of awe comes out of a capacity to be more fully present to the paradoxes of life. And one of the main paradoxes is that we're terribly fragile, vulnerable creatures, at the same time, as Becker puts it, that we're soaring angels and capable of great transcendence and self-creation and expansion of our worlds. But that's very hard to hold when one is in fear. So that's something that gets leveled very quickly. The vulnerable, limited human, when that person's world is torn apart by war or impoverishment or some form of devastation, again, they're going to do everything they can to cover up over, especially that vulnerable, more weak part, quote unquote, although it's not really weak, it's a part of life in a lot of ways. So anyway, the sense of awe I define as the humility and wonder, or sense of adventure toward living. And those individuals and collectives that have been able to stay with and work with and to some degree through their traumas, those non-dogmatic spiritual and philosophical groups, if you will, have been able to, I believe, achieve a greater inner freedom, which often leads to a greater outer freedom, capacity to range within one's thoughts, feelings, body sensations, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak. And as a result, enjoy the kind of the full enchilada of living. To have access to the poignancy of living. You know, death isn't just a negative, it's also, it directs our minds and hearts to what is essential about our lives and what is precious. And I mean, precious in an in-depth sense. The savoring, the need to savor our lives and to notice more about ourselves and others. And as a result, feel more of a participant in this gift of living. So that's what I see as the sense of awe. And I think that in order to cultivate that, one needs to be able to tolerate more anxiety, certainly death anxiety, and this is where depth psychotherapy can be very valuable in helping people not just talk about their anxieties, but really re-experience and get down into their bodily absorption of that anxiety and reoccupy, almost literally reoccupy their bodily being in living. And certainly forms of meditation can do this, and there are, you know, wonderful spiritual and philosophically oriented groups that have supported this.
So I guess one question that Margie and I, as we were discussing the book and this upcoming conversation that we're having, is looking where we are at this moment, it's before a very important election for the United States, and we're in the midst of COVID, and we have conversations around race and social injustice that have reached new kind of, at levels across the board. In your book, Kirk, you talk about revolutionary movements based on panic versus those based on awe. And in the conversations that I'm having with friends and family, I think that a lot of us are very hopeful that this is a moment where significant change can and has a good chance of happening. I'd like to kind of pose that question. How is everyone feeling at this moment? And really, Lewis, you talked about empathy, which I think is, definitely a conversation. I have kids. I know that we talk a lot about that in terms of kids, but, how do we as individuals, how do we participate in a revolution based on awe or wonderment or just empathy?
If I can maybe try and answer that, but also touch back to what you had said about with Steven Pinker, that, I think it's important to keep in mind that while there has been some increase in certain improvements that impact the lives of many people, there's not equal access to that. And for some people, there's still not access to that. That for many people living in urban areas, even having access to healthy food is difficult. And so I think until we have empathy for the least fortunate, for the marginalized groups, it's hard to feel that sense of hope. And I do believe very much in the power of awe, and that we need to connect with that. But some of the resources are, even to connect with some of these awe-inspiring things, are much more challenged for some people. We've seen dramatic increases between the incomes of the wealthy and the poor. And there's been some memes that are joking about this, but there's a reality to it that that we've seen an increase in employment, but for some people that's working 2-3 jobs to try and survive. So I think until we can kind of get to that understanding that includes all people in these marginalized groups that don't have the same access, it's going to be hard. And so while I have a degree of hope that maybe this can lead to a transformation, it's hard for me in a lot of ways to hold on to hope right now. Just looking at where things are at, looking at the degree of polarization, and also the continual divide. Dan Hokoi does a nice job. I've heard him talk a few times. I'm not sure if he's written anything up, but about the impact when we see these great divides between the wealthy and the poor, about how that has impacts on things like violence and other things as well. And when there tends to be greater disparities between the rich and poor, we tend to see more violence. And certainly in the United States, we have a great disparity. And we talk about the violence in other countries, but the violence in the United States is pretty scary as well. It has gone down some, even though the coverage of it, when you see the coverage of it, it's gone up some. But I think one thing that's, I think along a similar lines, at least in that connection with some of the multicultural aspects, is I think COVID's really revealed some of the weaknesses of our culture. For one, it's shown the weaknesses of the extreme individualism that we have in the United States. I think that plays a role in some of the denials that we see about research on COVID. It's just astounding to me, some of the things that I see people saying and posting about COVID that really has no basis, but it's posted in service of protecting what is perceived as freedom. But there, what we all have our chosen freedoms. There's a great Jim Croce line: "Let him live in freedom if he lives like me." And I think that is so emblematic of what we see in the United States so often, is that I don't think we're a country that deeply values freedom and an in-depth understanding of it. We're a country that values select freedoms that tend to benefit us and not worry about the freedoms that help other people.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think this is where we really need to indict our socioeconomic system. And this is where, I mean, it all kind of ties together. This is a systemic problem, and it also relates to Maslow's hierarchy of needs to some degree. If you don't have basic subsistence, you don't have the luxury to be present, to be more fully present to your life. You got to be present to getting that piece of bread, or just surviving in the streets. So yeah, how do we cultivate a society, or revisit the structure of our society in a way that it is more equitable and enables people to, more fully come into their own? Maybe Tom, you have some ideas there.
Well, I have to admit, I'm not very optimistic. There are, in theory, we have ideas about how to broach this, but the forces that are exacerbating the polarization are so powerful. But in terms of some of the some of the things that that our research and other people's research has sort of shown is that a sense of shared humanity, the value of compassion, a sense that we're all facing the same threats and challenges. We've done it, back in the years after 9/11, in the years when there was a lot more attention spent on the conflict in the Middle East. I connected with a psychologist in Iran and another one in Israel, and we set off on a series of experiments in which we would do things like we'd remind people of the sense of shared humanity. One way we did that is to have them just think about families and look at pictures of families from people all over the world. And we found that reversed the effect of being reminded of threatening things like death on the tendency to want to fight or to put the other person down, or in some studies actually to launch a preemptive nuclear attack. So lots and lots of studies that we've done show that when people are reminded of death, they become more negative towards the other and more supportive of violence towards them. But if before that, they see pictures of families, that eliminates that tendency. Another one that was inspired by the question of how is it that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all emphasize peaceful coexistence, love, and respect for other people and people who are different, yet these are three countries that are at each other's throats, that are talking about killing each other in various ways, and the hostility, whether it's the great Satan or the axis of evil, or whatever the politicians want to call it. This desire to kill is seen as something that people are doing in the name of God, or their God against the other God. So one of the things we did is we had religious fundamentalists in Colorado Springs before, or in the first part of our study, read some teachings, some quotes from Jesus in the Bible, like judge not lest you be judged, love your enemy, if someone strikes you, turn the other cheek. And in Iran, we had people read parallel verses from the Quran, be compassionate because Allah is compassionate. And what we found is, first of all, we'd have them read these things. Do you agree with these things? And people would say, yeah, absolutely, that's the way to live. Then after that, they were less likely to support war or hostile actions towards the other. So activating the value of compassion, activating a sense of shared humanity, or activating the sense that we're all in the same boat facing some pretty frightening threats. In one of our studies, we looked at reminding people of climate change. And we call it the sunny side of global warming, which was kind of cute. And you know, in the United States, it was interesting because a lot of people say, no, that's nonsense, that's not real. And so we had to say, well, you know, regardless of what you think, if this is real, and just imagine it is, how is this going to affect people in your country and all over the world? And after thinking about that shared fate, again, the things that normally drive people to support war were eliminated. In some cases, those frightening things led them to be more supportive of peacemaking. So those are things that, you know, those are, I think, some kind of good ideas. There are a lot of roots from them throughout history. You know, we didn't make those up. But the thing is, while all that's going on, we have politicians and pundits and news networks that are promoting a narrative where the other side is dangerous. The other side is evil. The other side is heartless monsters. And you could watch, you could watch Fox, MSNBC, CNN, which has kind of become less of a middle of the road station over the years, and then go to Facebook. I don't know, you know, most people I know who do social media don't have diverse friends on Facebook anymore. And every day there's the drums are beating about the evil of the other guy. And those are disturbing things that make it really hard to see common ground. So one of the things I'd like to raise the question for all of us, you know, in the face of that, and in the face of maybe real, you know, so I think those differences are exaggerated, but you know, how do you find common ground with the Proud Boys when the leader, you know, posts something like 12 things I hate about Jews? Like, how do you, you know, so you know, I think we're used to thinking, how can we get the conservative? Yeah, I'm not sure. No, I am pretty sure that the three of us are left-leaning folks. I don't know about the two moderators, but you know, we're used to think about how can we get the right wing to see things our ways. Well, but let's look at our own situation. How do we find common ground when people are chanting Jews won't replace us, and you know, the president says these are fine people, and 35-40% of Americans think that's pretty great. I mean, these are real, you know, my point is, in theory, yes, but how do we actually do it?
Yeah. I wonder if 30-40% of the people embrace those extremes per se. And I do see what you're saying.
Hope you're right.
I think one of the issues here is, as you say, exposing people to more humane kinds of perspectives. But I was thinking very much of Braver Angels, which is this new grassroots movement where citizens are taking these questions into their own hands and not letting their politicians speak for them per se, or the media, because they're sick and tired of it. So it is a citizens movement that brings self-identified liberals and conservatives together for living room style dialogues. It's highly structured, it's supportive. We've learned that these need to be structured, but so much of what these dialogues are about are helping people to get to know each other as people initially, before policy.
Yeah.
We're doing that even more with experiential democracy dialogues, which are about one-on-one encounters between people of very contrasting backgrounds. And one of the things we emphasize right off the bat is, first, take a collective breath and try to envision what it would be like to sit with this person. You know, what are the thoughts and feelings that come up around just being with this person, and see if you can observe those without getting stuck on those, and then come into a place of, can you see this person beyond the stereotype and beyond your initial reaction of who they are and what they represent? So can you envision that? And then a second phase is having each partner tell their story about where they came from, their background. And, you know, what sort of drove their particular policy value or what have you. And how did their family system or cultural system treat the other, whoever the other is in that conversation, in their background? All of these things are designed to help people see more of the nuances of each other.
Yeah.
And yeah, so yeah, how do we do that? Well, I think part of the issue is, can we get a critical mass of people who agree with this direction, this need for our society to get beyond the food fights, you know, the verbal flame throwing. And we certainly saw that epitomized in the last debate, the presidential debate. And if this isn't a poster session for, you know, the need for people to engage in more dialogues and empathy, I don't know what it is, because this is what it devolves into, I think, much too often in our culture.
That debate is a good example of kind of another side of my question. Is I am biased. I realize that. But to me, there was one person who was flinging the food, you know, and one person who was occasionally reacting to it. Mm-hmm. But I, you know, one of the things that, you know, and I wanted to say up front, I'm a partisan here. And I'm aware of that. I want anyone who's listening to be aware of it, but it just didn't look to me like those two guys went in with the same agenda, with the same approach. I mean, to me, it looked like one person was really trying to disrupt and make it an impossible experience. And the other person occasionally threw some insults back, but I don't, you know, I think he was thinking, well, how can I get some space to talk? So how do you deal, you know, when, you know, from your perspective, there's something, you know, there's a pretty clear right and wrong, I guess. Okay, you know, and again, an extreme example would be the white nationalists and Black Lives Matter. You know, I mean, I think some of the people that have aligned with Black Lives Matter have taken positions that aren't very helpful. But generally, I think the idea is hard to disagree with for many of us. And I think, you know, dealing with the fringe elements, people who adopt the movement as a way of expressing their own rage is one thing. But what, you know, when the differences are really fundamental.
Yeah.
And it may be that Donald Trump isn't a fair example or a fair representative of conservative thinking, and many conservatives say not, but he is a fair representative of a lot of conservative thinking. Mm-hmm.
Some conservatives may say that he's not, you know, in line with their politics, but yet they do not choose to step outside of what he's putting forth in a meaningful way.
It's, you know, I sort of think that really nowadays it's more animosity towards the other side than real enthusiasm for your own side. You know, it's more like, you know, I think what's energizing the left is Trump, and what's energizing the right might be, I don't know, Black Lives Matter, I suppose, and some of the more further left people. Although when centrists are put up, they're equally energized, I guess. I don't know, equally.
I had a number of thoughts come to mind. You know, I think one of those I'm reminded just of the kind of iconic line from Nirvana song, "Here we are, entertain us." That seems to be our culture and the way that we consume news now, is that we've turned news into entertainment, and extremes are more entertaining than centrist or deep thought. Memes are more entertaining than having a thoughtful discussion about things. Headlines often are more entertaining than reading the article and getting an in-depth understanding of things. And I think that's that certainly has fueled a lot of it. But I think one thing, and I mean this in the debates literally, but in other situations metaphorically, we've got to know when to turn the mic off. And it's one of the things that I've been paying attention to, both with clients and also with friends and family members as well, is looking at the political stress. Because right now, I think that the baseline level of stress in the United States and really the world is higher than what it typically is, because of COVID and a lot of what's happening in the political world. And this is something to talk with my clients about. Through most of my about 25 years of being a therapist, politics rarely ever came up with clients. Now it's extremely rare that I have a client that doesn't bring it up politics. And I think that's something that's evident there too. So one of the things I've been talking with a number of people about, including clients, is trying out some different things about where they get their information. There's a great resource, Media Bias Fact Check, that it's got a website. You can go and they evaluate, it's a nonpartisan group, and they evaluate all these different news sources about how factual they are and whether they're right or left leaning. And so I've encouraged clients to just go on there and look, find some of the less biased ones and less dramatic ones, and use those for your primary source of news, and turn off some of these extremes. And also watch that balance between being informed and being over-informed, and try and decrease that. Once you understand the basics of the issue, don't keep going and reading more. And I've had both clients and friends and family say that as they've done this, they've decreased their level of stress, decreased their level of fear, and they've also felt more informed some of the time. Not all of them, because some have just kind of learned to, as they found the benefits, they just kind of cut that out altogether. But I think that is something that can really help. And I just want to throw in kind of one thing with Black Lives Matter too, that I think one of the challenges with that organization is they're part of a new protest movement that's a decentralized one. A lot of us are more familiar with, when we think about the civil rights movements, where they're centered around these charismatic leaders. And Black Lives Matter has been very intentional about, as well as a lot of other protest movements in recent times, they've worked to decentralize. And that has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is, when you're focused around one or a small number of charismatic individuals, if anything happens with them, either from controversy or their deaths, that can really impact the movement in some rather dramatic ways. But so we get some of the advantages in that decentralized, that it's not as dependent upon these. But the risks are, anyone can claim to be a member of Black Lives Matter. What I really encourage people to do is go to their website and read what they say. They talk about being a family-friendly organization and what that means to them. And that's, the more, the people that have been really more central in the development of that movement, I tend to try to look to them for my understanding of the movement, and that's going to evolve over time. And I'm not, as a white male, I don't want to speak for the movement. I don't think that's my place, but rather to try and understand where they're coming from. But we're always, I think, gonna, in these decentralized movements, whether it be the Occupy movement or Black Lives Matter, we're going to see some of these very different views that are claiming to be the spokesperson of the movement, and that's not really what these movements are trying to do.
I just want to add that I think we're in a race against time. And what I mean by that is that we are too quickly approaching a point of no return. I think that's the most dangerous point in these polarization cycles, is where the extremes just basically take over. And they take over because you have leaders like Trump who pour the gasoline on the fire of other people who are in minority, but who can be very loud and violent. That then causes, we're back to the Greek notion of hubris and nemesis, that then causes backlashes or growing backlashes on the sides where people certainly didn't intend to be in that mode. And, you know, we're trying to approach things in a more humanistic way, let's say, but end up almost feeling forced to come back with an equal vengeance or even stronger. And so that's why I think we've got to do everything we can to as you were suggesting, Tom, prime people in a sense in terms of the more humane kinds of literature and doctrines that are out there, and mobilize these citizen movements of citizens who don't want to go down this path of, basically war. And when has that been tried on a mass scale? I know it's not very politic to bring up some of the left-wing extremes that we've suffered through history, but that has happened. And I think, you think about Stalin and Mao, for example, these are people and cultures that felt extremely oppressed by their oppressors. And by, you could say, right-wing forces and monarchic forces, what have you. And they then surged up in a very autocratic way from their perspective. And then that just perpetuates the cycle. So I feel like we're really in a new possibility here for a deeper democracy. It's one way to put it, where people, we just need to begin to be more present with one another, with ourselves, and work with more of these experiential kind of contacts with each other. To get to the foundational problems.
One difference between our situation and Russia becoming the Soviet Union and the extreme, the communist movement of the early to middle 20th centuries, is that they were responding to a monarchy, an autocracy, and we're working in the background of democracy. And this is an interesting situation where I guess the goal, the hope was that democracy would take us beyond this, but democracy has, something's happened that makes democracy not work as a democracy right now. The money in politics is one example. There are many, many examples, which probably gets beyond where we want to go today, but maybe we need to find a way to think about how what's happening in the context of democracy of difference is different. And maybe, I hope the answer is to find ways of democracy working better than moving towards some alternative to democracy. Communism as an ideal is democratic. It's not the way it was practiced by the people who took over in Russia and China and in North Korea and other places. I suppose, we could think, how do we save democracy? Or how do we improve democracy? One could argue democracy was never perfect. It probably never will be perfect, but there have been problems maybe throughout our history. And some would say maybe our problems aren't all that different than, earlier generations faced. They're different than what any of us face in our lifetime, though, I think. since the 50s or so on, we've had our issues, but they're not like they are today. And again, you could argue, unless you were white, things weren't so great in the past either.
Yeah. I wonder if some ways we haven't become polarized around the idea of democracy, and then that's distorted our understanding of it. I tend to think that, when we look at all these major political systems, all of them have the potential to be, if done in an idealistic manner, to be very effective and promote the freedom and human dignity of people. And all of them have potential to be corrupted. But we have, in some ways, idealized democracy so much that we don't recognize the flaws in our particular democracy. And of course, it's often pointed out it's not a pure democracy, and it never was intended to be. But I think we also tend to conflate democracy with capitalism too often today. And I think a lot of people don't really think about and understand how those can fit together and not fit together as well. Joel Voss has written a book recently that talks about the capitalist life syndrome, which I think is just a fascinating topic of, and again, that's not to say that capitalism is necessarily an evil system or a bad system, but there's a lot of people that struggle to acknowledge the limitations of that. And I'm wondering, I don't know if either of you have thoughts about, is polarization and causing distortion in both our understanding of capitalism and democracy, and is that part of the problem that we're dealing with as well?
I think so. I think mercantilism has been a huge problem since the beginning of the country. And it's often gone along with racism as well. What's been fueling it? Well, again, I think we need to go back to fear and anxiety. I mean, did our forebears base this headlong drive toward materialism and consumption of money out of terror of the place that they came from before, let's say England, parts of Europe, where they felt mistreated, they were relatively impoverished. Well, it's just how fear can drive one to the extremes of any policy. And so how do we come back to a more deliberative basis for how we proceed, a more life-affirming basis, rather than trying to get away from something, which is usually the strongest imps toward autocracy and fascism, etc. Is there something we want to move toward? Can we find the wherewithal and the centeredness to do that? It does take that. And that's why I know this may sound a little eccentric, but I honestly call for an army of depth healers to move into our culture with the same speed and intensity as the army of combatants that we have now. Why isn't it just as important that we enable, fuller, longer term, more emotionally corrective relationships for people on a much wider scale? At least make those available.
It sounds like a wonderful topic or crescendo to end with. Army of healers. So, Kristen, did you have any last words that you'd like to say, or last question or anything? Or how does this feel? It feels like a good stopping point.
I think it does. I think just as we had mentioned, we we realize there isn't one single answer to this, but it's so good to thank you all for bringing your different perspectives. Really, yes, I feel like we could have 10 more conversations in all different directions, but good. Well, and I would agree, eccentric or not, an army of healers feels just about right at this moment.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and the spirited conversation. We're both grateful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.